All right, friends, welcome to the Department of Architecture and Urban Design lecture series. Very pleased to have you here on our campus. I see that many of you are visiting campus. We don't, of which hosts also a number of buildings that Franklin Israel designed. So I'm sure you're aware of this, as it seems that some of you, having met you just now, even are very intimately familiar with his architecture. But I'm here not to talk about Franklin Israel because I don't know as much about Franklin Israel as our esteemed guest, Todd Gannon, whom I met, and this is what I'll talk about, in 2008 when I moved here. So that was the Great Recession. It was about the time, like I moved in August and Obama was elected in November. So it was a very different time. What I knew about Todd when I got here was that he was involved in something called the LA Forum, which I quickly got involved in because of him and Muhammad, and that he was a swimmer. I also knew that he was writing a dissertation at UCLA on Reyner Banham, and by way of the archograms, as he introduced them to me. I knew them a little bit, but he knew them, again, far better than I did. And in fact, it was funny that he was working on Banham because that was exactly the literature that I had been reading and kind of critiquing through my dissertation. So I was even kind of perhaps trying to replace with another kind of historiography. So in a certain way, we both had the same object of interest, but maybe a divergent reading of it. And on meeting Todd, the first impression he gave was of being an architect. And then as I got to know him a little more, I realized that he was also a chronicler of architecture. This, in addition to teaching and coordinating the history and theory sequence at SCI-Arc for a number of years, and not casually, also a critic of architecture, and a very good one at that. Soon, the Banham book was in production, and it was called The Paradoxes of High Tech. And Todd quickly started another manuscript, also on the same press, which you see here on Frank Israel, which he'll present to us tonight. All this, and not just a few, but many other writings in between, including a brilliant book of collected essays that just came out last year, which he presented to us, I believe, as well. Called Figments of the Architectural Imagination. So to be friends with such productive types is a bit of a burden. Scriptomania. Todd moved then from Los Angeles, away from all his friends here, to Columbus, to his friends there in 2017, where he joined the faculty at OSU's Knowlton School as the head of the architecture section. So having just read Joe Day's wonderful preface to that collected volume that Todd published last year, I now know that Todd is not just a swimmer, but also a cyclist. That I didn't know at all. Is that true? Yeah, okay. So something of a sportsman, which is, I suppose, fitting for the university that he works in, where he was also a student for some time. So what else I learned from the preface is that Todd lives without the ambivalence found in the protagonists of Philip Roth's book, Goodbye Columbus, which isn't about Columbus, Ohio at all, but quotes some song about Columbus, Ohio. But I'm referring to this only because it's a segue for me to say that Todd is actually a very devoted member of what you might call a clan. Which one? What clan, you ask? And how would we know of his devotion? Well, according to Joe in that preface, and I can confirm this from here, having heard him say this a number of times, Todd refers to architects with the first person plural pronoun we, which is cool, but it's a commitment. So what does it mean to be committed to architecture? Is it a marriage like me? I'm married to an architect. Or is it to be committed as an involuntary commitment? Or is it rather a voluntary imprisonment? These are the questions that I think he might answer tonight in his unique style of analysis. Indeed, we might also need to talk about formalism, a sort of denomination within the clan of architecture. And here we, Todd and I, have an alignment of sorts. For formalists, there's a deep belief in the power of interpretation. It's like psychoanalysis, I think. After all, what is a work of architecture without an internal pathology? Nevertheless, while both of us do hail from this branch of the architectural clan, we have found differences that make our encounters both combative and fun. Just because you wear the same glasses, as it turns out, doesn't mean you see things the same way. Welcome, Todd Gannon.
Thank you, Michael. It's I don't know. I went to school here. I spent a lot of time in this room in various ways, and one of the real joys of coming back to LA now is every time I come, I get these amazing introductions. So you know, let's keep this streak alive. I'm really I couldn't be happier. It is true, I have a past on two wheels and I have the knees to prove it. One of them is kind of new, so anyway, thank you very much for that. Thank you, Mariana, for having me out yet again. And I'd also like to thank the good people at the Getty up on the Hill for publishing this book and for giving me a chance to spend so much time thinking about this guy. Now, I know that, well, before I get ahead of myself, I know there are a lot of Frank's colleagues and collaborators and friends and clients and former students perhaps in the room. And I want to thank all of them too for helping me to write this book. I mean, I did a lot of the research during COVID on Zoom, interviewing people who knew Frank through the 1990s and really made a lot of friends along the way. So it was a really nice experience to write a book that has a kind of built-in sadness, as we'll see. Oh, there's the light. Much better. Now, the book is part biography and part architectural history, and it's rooted in the archival holdings at the Getty Research Institute. It also draws on around 150 hours of interviews that I conducted and other archival interviews by Tom Hines, an emeritus professor here, Joe Day, Aaron Betsky, and others. Now, many of you knew Frank. I did not. I encountered his work. There's Frank. I encountered his work as a student in the early 1990s at Ohio State. Like many of my colleagues, I wanted to rip off his model making techniques. I was particularly interested in the way that he laminated this crumpled craft paper to chipboard models, and I spent loads of time trying to replicate that effect with mixed results. It's harder than it looks, it turns out. You have to get the amount of glue just right. But the results are mixed, and they're evidenced by this bit of archival material that was not held at the Getty Research Institute. Heather, you took the studio, didn't you? Around this time, Israel was at the height of his fame. His mature works were nearing completion. He had released 2 monographs in quick succession, and he was enjoying national and international attention. They're not flipping here, but that's okay. In the spring of 1996, he was honored with a solo show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, and it is with that show that I'll begin the story. On February 13th, 1996, some 350 guests attended a private opening of Out of Order Franklin D. Israel. The crowd, sipping cocktails and trading gossip in Arata Isasaki's celebrated facility, was abuzz. Inside, a warm glow suffused the maple underfoot and drew guests into a striking assemblage of skewed plaster planes. Although the planes appeared at first to have been roughly folded and crammed into place, a closer look revealed an uncanny precision. Some were cantilevered dramatically or resolved in improbable points. Others folded back on themselves to form intimate pockets that beckoned to be explored. Just beyond a last array of serrated forms, the warm light gave way to electric blue. A long table slashed across the space. A gray framework leaned in beyond, and a plaster shard careened overhead before turning down to lodge itself in the gallery floor. From a large portrait affixed to the framework, Israel looked on with a knowing smirk. The show ran through the end of May and received widespread praise. Some of the most poignant comments came from Herbert Muchamp of the New York Times, who described the way that Israel's buildings evoke the nature of shelter and that elusiveness of the sense of permanence it was once architecture's mission to secure. And then, more sadly, he pointed out that it has fallen to Israel's generation to negotiate a contract between stellar promise and early death. For Israel, that contract came due on June 10th, just 2 weeks after Out of Order closed, when he succumbed to complications of AIDS. Now, what I'd like to do tonight is trace an overview of Frank's life and work through the chapters of the book. I'm not going to go deeply into any of the chapters except one. I did put together a version of this that did go deeply into it. It would have been about 4.5 hours long. So buy the book if you want to hear more. They're available in the back. Oh, and I just remembered, a little aside, I was just informed that that book Michael described, Figments of the Architectural Imagination, is about to be remaindered because of slow sales. So you want to do me a solid, you could get a copy, learn about my cycling past. Back to the story. What I will do is move through those first several chapters fairly quickly so that we can linger a little bit longer on chapter 6, which focuses on some of Frank's late work, including his scheme for the Getty Villa renovation, the Arts Building at UC Riverside, and the Dan House in Malibu. So with that, on with our story. Israel was born in Brooklyn in 1945 to left-leaning Russian Jewish parents who named him after FDR. He described an unhappy childhood in suburban Elizabeth, where he spent long hours alone in the attic, which he transformed into an elaborate puppet theater. He also enjoyed watching the construction of new suburban homes in the neighborhood, and by middle school had taken up designing his own ranch-style homes as a hobby. If Israel was unhappy at home, he loved the summers he spent at Camp Tahoney, a progressive boys' camp in the Berkshires. There, he claims to have designed his first completed building, a small cabin for the camp newspaper. I was never able to confirm this feat, but I did learn something about his penchant for playful fabulation. Though he may well have made drawings like these in the 1950s, he made these drawings in the 1990s when he recreated them to illustrate his monograph. Music played an important role at Camp Tahoney, and in the 1950s, Israel and several other boys were enlisted as gophers for the musicians at the nearby Tanglewood Music Center. Israel was paired with Aaron Copland, and he quickly became enamored with the man and his music. With just a few adjustments, a description of Copland's music by his Tanglewood colleague Leonard Bernstein could as well be ascribed to Israel's later architecture. All of it, Bernstein says, is American in spirit, whether it's jazz or square dance tunes or cowboy songs or rock and roll. It's like all those different accents we have in our speech. There's a little Mexican in the Texas accent, a little Swedish in Minnesota, a little Slavic in Brooklyn, a little Irish in Boston, but they're all American accents. They've been absorbed. The Third Symphony by Aaron Copland has a lot of these American qualities: jazz rhythms and wide open spaces and the simplicity and sentimentality and mix of things from all over the world. A noble fanfare, a hymn, everything. After Camp Tahoney, where Frank was a counselor through his high school years, he graduated high school and he began his architectural studies at the University of Pennsylvania in 1963. Like I said, I'm not going to go too deeply, but you can see his most important teachers flash by on the screen. He moved on to graduate study at Yale and then Columbia, where he collected a professional Bachelor of Architecture degree in 1970. At Penn, his most important teachers were Lou Kahn, whose forms he found beautiful, and Robert Venturi, who's iconic. I should go and show you these guys. And Robert Venturi, whose iconoclastic ideas and self-proclaimed ugly and ordinary buildings he found provocative. At Yale, Israel would notice a similar tension between the modernist legacy of the school's previous chairman, Paul Rudolph, and the more humanistic approach of his successor, Charles Moore, who took over just before Israel arrived. Israel was unhappy at Yale, and he seems to have suffered something of a nervous breakdown soon after he arrived. He dropped out in his first semester and relocated to Manhattan the following year. He enrolled at Columbia in the fall of 1968 in the aftermath of the famous student uprising of the previous spring. He had little patience for the commotion. As many of his classmates pursued openly political and often less than architectural agendas, Israel maintained the orthodox manner he had learned at Penn and emulated the work of Columbia's chairman Romaldo Giurgola in his own studio projects. And here are just a couple of those studio projects, and I promised Mariana, for the students' sake, I would linger on these a little bit, but pretty nice and really Giurgolesque. Soon after graduation, Israel joined the board at the Architectural League of New York, where he assisted a young Robert A.M. Stern with curating exhibitions and organizing public programming. He also liked to hang around at Peter Eisenman's Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, the quasi-graduate school and think tank Eisenman founded in the late 1960s. Israel looked up to both men, as he did to Philip Johnson, scion of New York's modernist establishment, whom Israel befriended around the same time. This was the moment of the famous debate between Eisenman's neo-modernist whites and Stern's neo-traditional grays. The two groups garnered national attention with their famous 5-on-5 showdown, some of which took place right here at UCLA, edited by Israel's close friend Suzanne Stevens and published in the Architectural Forum. For his part, Israel acted as a sort of go-between among the various players. He was one of the few characters that was welcome on both sides of that street. And he even claimed to have coined the phrase white and gray. When I asked Bob Stern about this in an interview, he couldn't remember the details, but he admitted that Israel's claim was plausible. He actually said, "I don't know, why don't you give us both credit?" So credit has been given. In any event, Israel drew on the work of both sides of the debate in his design for his first completed building, the Snell House in East Hampton of 1972. The house was commissioned by Philip and Ida Snell, the former camp doctor and nurse at Camp Tahoney. In it, Israel drew obvious inspiration from Charles Gwathmey's nearby house for his parents, as well as from the Lemon House by his employer at the time, Giovanni Pazzanella. Neither Stern nor Stevens liked the house very much, but that didn't stop them from promoting their ambitious friend. Stevens wrote a brief treatment in the Architectural Forum, while Stern convinced the historian Vincent Scully to find space for the project in his 1974 pro-gray polemic, The Shingle Style Today. Stern also included Israel as a key figure among the 40 Under 40 exhibition that he assembled 2 years later. By the time Scully's book appeared, Israel had left New York for a fellowship at the American Academy in Rome. Both Stern, who served on the jury, and Philip Johnson had a hand in securing the fellowship for him. His design work included a curious postmodernist pool house for Audrey Hepburn, who was living in Rome at the time. In a letter to Stern, he gushed about what he called a potential commission from the Hollywood star, and he included this tantalizing sketch. Years later, he was more forthright about his celebrity clients. "I did this project as a fictional birthday present from Hepburn's husband," he admitted in an interview. "It certainly wasn't a real project." And if you read this letter to Bob Stern, it was very clearly pitched as a real project. Toward the end of his fellowship, Israel was reluctantly considering a job in Pittsburgh when Jack Robertson, for whom he'd worked in New York, invited him to join the team for a major urban design project in Iran. The Shahstan Pahlavi, a multi-billion-dollar proposal commissioned by the Shah, was to transform Tehran into a major world city. Israel served as senior project architect and developed the scheme as anti-government sentiment simmered in Tehran. By 1976, the situation had grown so dangerous that the team relocated to London to complete their work, which was abandoned well before the Shah was driven into exile in 1979. Israel hung around in London and had what he described as a wild group of friends. And though he loved London, the lack of long-term job prospects sent him back to New York. He took a job he didn't like with Davis Brody, and he leapt at the chance to move to the West Coast when Charles Moore called with an offer to teach one 10-week studio here at UCLA. He arrived in fall of 1977 and quickly found his place among the UCLA architecture faculty, which at the time included such characters as Craig Hodgetts, you can see there, Coy Howard, Tim Vreeland, Moore. You can also see Peter de Bretteville and Robert Mangurian in that photo. Heady times. Though Israel was a popular instructor, his part-time precarity soon had him looking for other ways to make ends meet. Through one of his students, he landed a job in Hollywood working on Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Soon afterwards, he relocated to the Philippines and to serve as art director on Night Games, a campy and thoroughly terrible erotic thriller starring Cindy Pickett, who you may know as Ferris Bueller's mom, and directed by Roger Vadim. And this is one of the hardships of doing archival research. It took me months to find a copy of this film, and then I finally watched it. It's just awful. And Frank admits this in an interview. He's like, yeah, it's a pretty terrible movie. So don't feel obliged to rush out and watch it. You'll be sorry you did. Unless you have some nostalgia for like 1980s Skinamax. In any event, after working on the film, Israel worked on and off for Paramount Studios, took other independent set design work, and even tried his hand at screenwriting. He also became a regular contributor at Architectural Digest, Progressive Architecture, and the popular men's magazine GQ, where he had a semi-regular column for about 2.5 years. By 1983, Israel had cut ties with Hollywood. Why he did so is unclear, but according to Machamp, it had something to do with his thwarted desire for acceptance by the so-called Velvet Mafia, a group of Hollywood power players purported to wield significant behind-the-scenes power and, allegedly, to trade industry opportunities for sex. It's difficult to corroborate Machamp's story, which I unpack more thoroughly in the book, but Israel's social and professional networks included many purported members of the group, which included Steve Rebell and Ian Schrager, owners of Studio 54 and later Israel's clients. Further, and though this is not in the book, I think this guy on the left, photographed at Studio around 1980, looks a whole lot like Frank Israel. Around this time, Israel first began to suspect that he too had contracted the mysterious gay cancer that had gay men across the country complaining of listlessness, inexplicable weight loss, swollen lymph nodes, and curious blemishes. In response to his symptoms, he threw himself into researching the growing crisis and became a committed advocate for safe sex and AIDS research. He adopted a rigorous fitness regimen, began to take a battery of vitamin supplements and an evolving cocktail of medications. He was swimming in the same pool I used to swim in up at Sunset Canyon. And he developed a tendency toward hypochondria and an obsession with cleanliness. To his friends, he often seemed to complain endlessly. Sometimes even the doctors wouldn't want to answer his calls, remembered his longtime partner, Kamal Koza. Another friend, the producer Mary Lambert, said he wasn't complaining, but rather he was making an art form out of whining. For his part, Israel's illness seems to have inspired in him a new sense of purpose. Having AIDS isn't the worst thing, he confided in his longtime collaborator, Barbara Callis. It has made me focus. Through those early years in LA, Israel was hard at work building his architectural practice. His earliest projects are notable for their range of stylistic experimentation. Some of his clients came as referrals from his friend and mentor, Frank Gehry. Philip Johnson introduced the two men soon after Israel arrived in LA, and they remained close friends till the end of Israel's life. It was Gehry who sent the actor and playwright Joel Grey and his wife Jo Wilder Israel's way. Drawing on the infatuation with Le Corbusier's villas he developed in Europe, Israel devised for them a taut neo-Corbusian scheme that exudes a distinctly nautical air. While in Manila, he produced a set of bamboo bungalows. I don't know what's going on the screen, so, okay. He produced a set of bamboo bungalows that recall the iconic stilt-borne Bahay Cubos constructed by indigenous Filipinos. Back in LA, he experimented with postmodern historicism in the Clark House, an intelligently organized riff on Vignola's Villa Farnese. And there's also the case of the Karnak Apartments, which Israel showed in an exhibition called West Coast Alternatives, assembled by Stanley Tigerman in 1982. The facade, which screens a no-frills apartment building, features cartoonish Egyptian revival elements rendered in the ubiquitous stucco of LA's mid-city sprawl. The columns frame a stylized entry portal that calls to mind, depending on one's tendency toward prurience, a fire plug, or a stubby, erect penis. All told, it's a witty and lighthearted affair, free of any pretensions to historical exactitude, in step with the cheeky revivalism of the day, and most certainly not the work of Franklin D. Israel. In fact, the Karnak apartments were designed and built in 1925 by the Hollywood set designer and developer J.M. Close. Why Israel would appropriate this work is unclear. One might simply chalk it up to playful fabulation, but it's tempting to imagine an elaborate in-joke with Tigerman, whose overtly phallic Daisy House had recently made headlines. And you can see, if you look closely at the before image on the screen, it's quite clearly a different building altogether. So the renovated facade that he described in the catalog was slightly embellished. And that embellishment was really a big part of Frank's personality, that he was a bit of a jokester. In any way, in a somewhat more serious mode, Israel secured commissions from several well-heeled clients, including this sprawling renovation for Andrea Rich, an administrator and eventually vice chancellor here at UCLA, and her husband, the producer John Rich. Rather than complete the project, the Riches divorced, and Israel completed a reduced version of the scheme for John and went on to complete several commissions for Andrea, with whom he would remain a close friend. Around the same time, Israel was hired to renovate Misty Mountain, a 10,000 square foot mansion designed by Wallace Neff and owned by Jules Stein, head of the legendary talent agency MCA and namesake of the I Institute here on campus, which I know from experience. Israel spent several years on the project before it was abruptly canceled and the house was sold to Rupert Murdoch. Lachlan owns it today. Israel's most important project of the period was the widely published penthouse for Rick Gillette, a renowned hair and makeup artist he had met in London. Gillette loved the work of Louis Barragan and asked Israel to, quote, borrow a few pages from the Barragan catalog in the design. Israel reluctantly complied, but as he would do with the work of other architects, he swerved Barragan's sensibility to new ends, trading the Mexican architect's simple asymmetrical planes and poetically empty precincts for symmetrical masses that shared the space with Gillette's eclectic profusion of furniture and artwork that seemed to echo the attic refuge Israel had constructed for himself as a child. In many projects through the 1980s, Israel adopted a referential approach akin to his treatment of Le Corbusier for the Greys, Vignola for the Clarks, and Barragan for Gillette. The unbuilt Arrow House, for example, is an homage to Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown's residential projects. The producer David Bombick requested a riff on modern houses he'd lived in previously by Rob Millay Stevens and Cedric Gibbons. For Mid-Atlantic Toyota, a commission he received on Frank Gehry's recommendation, Israel developed an ambitious expansion of an auto parts distribution facility Gehry had designed a few years before. In a beachfront condominium in Malibu for the director Robert Altman, he drew on his longstanding affection for the work of Carlos Scarpa. And for the fashion designer Michel Lamy, Israel returned to Rudolf Schindler, whose How House inspired the rigorously symmetrical elevation and corner windows. The interior echoes the work of Charles and Ray Eames and again, Frank Gehry. He took a similar approach with the Weissman Pavilion, which we can understand, there's that we can understand as a much enlarged Lamy Pavilion turned inside out, with Lamy's interior balcony here turned to the exterior, hanging like a lifeboat over the lush gardens below. A breakthrough project came in 1988 with Propaganda Films. Here, Israel drew on a laundry list of sources: Gehry, Piranesi, the Roman city of Ostia Antica, the client's favorite movie. But as he had done in earlier schemes, he swerved these sources in a new direction and treated them, as his assistant Milena Murdoch described, as muses. As artists had muses to paint, she explained, Frank would collect muses from other architects, but it was never copied. If he was inspired by something Venturi did for his mom, for example, or if he was inspired by Frank Gehry, he was asking the viewer to really pay attention. It wasn't easy access. 1988 was a big year for Frank Israel, and it concluded with a solo show at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. 6 mementos for the next millennium featured 6 small wood frame pavilions, each containing drawings and models of recent buildings, arranged in a simple grid to form a stylized city within the gallery walls. Israel's title referred to Italo Calvino's then recently released 6 Memos for the Next Millennium, and the book's twin themes of optimism and melancholy resonate with the ambivalent poetics of Israel's architecture and the ever-present reality of his battle with HIV. Notice in the plan that the 6 pavilions are entered from the perimeter, which cancels any notion of a central communal space and reflects the isolation that Israel saw in Los Angeles urbanism. One pavilion contained 6 pine trees, heightened the sense of an alienation. Lacking an entry, its interior could not be accessed at all. Around the same time, Israel brought in 3 important collaborators, Barbara Callis, Stephen Shortridge, and Annie Chu. Within a few years, each of them would become partners in the firm, and each of them would leave an important stamp on the work. With more experience than her younger colleagues, Callis developed design work and oversaw the business and managerial aspects of the firm. Shortridge or Chu usually took the lead on project design and development. Israel guided the overall direction of the operation, leaving piles of his trademark sketches behind after each visit to his colleagues' desks. Frank was the chef, Callis recalled. There were a lot of hands in it, but he was the chef. It was going to taste the way Frank wanted it to taste. A comparison of a few projects from the early 1990s can show the sort of influence these young architects had on the practice. Shortridge led the design teams for the Goldberg Bean and Baldwin residences, and in them we can see his tendency toward plans governed by complex geometrical matrices and projects built up from a multiplicity of parts, as well as a taste for thin planes that wind through plans and hover over building masses. In projects led by Chu, by contrast, we see a tendency toward complex 3-dimensional folding and earthbound massing, as in the Wu Fong Pavilion in Silver Lake and in the Southern Regional Library facility here on UCLA's campus. In the mid-1980s, Israel began to be associated with the so-called LA School, a cadre of young, like-minded practitioners loosely clustered around their reluctant eminence grise, Frank Gehry. I get into this much more in the book, but for now, it's important to point out the strange sense of familiarity that exuded from many of their projects, a sense undoubtedly fueled by the omnipresence of Los Angeles in the global cultural imaginary. Indeed, for all their idiosyncrasy and exoticism, the small-scale vernacular origins and humble materials of many of these projects tied them inextricably to the anonymous stick-framed fabric of any American city. In this sense, the projects of the LA School and the backstories of many of the architects were the architectural equivalents of the scrappy small-town nobodies of film and television who relocated to the West Coast, adopted an eye-catching new look, and launched themselves on a path to stardom. Israel could certainly identify with such a narrative, and though he missed out on some of the earlier achievements of the group, he quickly caught up. He soon began his own brand of complex drawings and models, including these distinctive composites developed by a young Lindy Roy. He took part in a number of exhibitions, including this installation here in Perloff Hall, and the architectural press kept a keen interest in his work. His 2 monographs further fueled his notoriety, as did the increasing quality, self-assurance, and conviction of his projects. Chief among these was his scheme for the brand consultancy Brighton Associates in Venice on Abercrombie Boulevard. He worked to unify 3 buildings on Abercrombie, the former home of the Eames office, into a coherent composition. He added carefully composed additions in metal and glass to the exterior of the building and treated the interior as an axially organized urban village populated by idiosyncratic forms and a carefully choreographed sequence of figural spaces. He took a similar approach with the offices for Tish Avnet in Culver City, though here the sequence unfolds as much in section as in plan. And there's the interior of Tisch Avnet. But I want you to pay attention to the plan for a minute. I think that this is, I wish there were more students here because this is the kind of stuff we want you to do. So watch carefully. At Bright, as you can see here in the plan, one experiences a controlled cadence of spatial compression and expansion that begins in the open parking lot and proceeds like a drumbeat through the interior. And if you look there, parking lot, vestibule, atrium, tunnel, campo, conference room, and so on. And then you turn 90 degrees, and that same compression and expansion moves down along that axis. At Tisch Avnet, which you can see in this axonometric, the rhythm alternates between horizontal and vertical spaces. So you start at the bottom of the street, then the lobby goes vertical, the axis goes horizontal, the oculus goes vertical, the hallway to the conference room goes horizontal again, and then finally the conference room goes vertical. So really incredibly careful in the way that space is kind of organized. So thus, while they clearly resonate with the Gillette Penthouse and propaganda films, the Bright and Tisch Avnet offices signal a crucial advancement of Israel's approach, with the earlier projects operating primarily through the juxtaposition of objects, and the latter through the orchestration of contrasting spatial conditions. Another crucial component of Israel's formal vocabulary was the folded plane, a hallmark of LA School architecture to which he devoted considerable attention. Michael was not lying when he said we were going to get into some formalism tonight. The earliest folded plane in his portfolio can be seen in this stair tower of the unbuilt John Tesh residence, while the technique is developed much more convincingly in the Hague House, as well as the Baldwin House, the Wufong Pavilion, and this masterful first scheme for the Friedland House in Florida. In an essay on folding I'll publish later this year, I go into more detail on Israel's pioneering contributions to the technique. For now, I'll leave you with this brief quote from Frank about his interest in folding. And all of Frank's students could do these like just spot on imitations of his very distinctive voice. I cannot, so you'll have to imagine it. Or if one of you can still do it, you can come up and read these lines. Folding strategies have arisen out of a variety of concerns, mathematics and physics for some, conceptual and minimalist art practice for others. My interest in folding has mainly to do with the intersection of architecture and landscape, with the implications of removing, replacing, and reorienting the ground plane. And so this is the final chapter that we'll linger a little longer on a couple of projects. Israel's steady rise in notoriety through the early 1990s coincided with a period of economic uncertainty and social turmoil in his adopted home in Los Angeles. In 1990, the US economy slipped into a recession that hit Southern California particularly hard and exacerbated social and political adversity that had been simmering in the region for decades. Increasingly violent gang activity, fueled by an explosion in the use of crack cocaine, sensationalized by the media and mythologized in the gangster rap of Ice-T and NWA, burned images of Uzi-toting teens, drive-by shootings, and the color-coded streetwear of the Bloods and the Crips into the popular imagination, as it reflected increasingly desperate conditions in places like Compton, South Central, and Watts. The intensifying pressure between the LAPD and inner-city neighborhoods reached its boiling point in April 1992, with the eruption of citywide rioting after the acquittal of 4 officers who viciously beat a young Black man, Rodney King, during a traffic stop the previous year. Tragedy struck again in 1994 with the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman in upscale Brentwood, then devolved into tabloid media farce with the sensational arrest, televised trial, and ultimate acquittal of former football star O.J. Simpson for the crime. The early 1990s also were marked by natural disasters, some of which directly impacted Israel's practice, including the powerful Northridge earthquake of 1994 and the devastating wildfires in the Berkeley Hills and in Malibu, which burned more than 50,000 acres. Amid the chaos, the AIDS pandemic raged, and Israel's own illness took an increasing toll. He underwent chemotherapy at UCLA and was prescribed an evolving battery of medications. To ease his chronic back pain, he set up a cot in his Robertson Boulevard offices, from which he often gave direction to his collaborators and sometimes met with his clients. Through the early 1990s, he was starting to be considered for a larger work, including an important competition to expand the J. Paul Getty Museum, now the Getty Villa, in 1993. Along with 5 other firms, Israel was given a blank sketchbook to fill with ideas for the project. Now we're not advancing. Right. Are there 2 versions of this open? Is that what's happening? All right, who's in charge of this laptop? It's worked before.
Fancy.
No, but it's advancing here, but this does not seem to be drawing from the file that's on the screen. Here. Now we're back where
Okay, let's try.
but this one still won't map, but that's okay. I've been dealing with that the whole time. Okay. Yes, thank you. Through the 1990s, Israel was being considered for larger work, including an important competition to expand the J. Paul Getty Museum, now the Getty Villa. Along with 5 other firms, he was given a blank sketchbook to fill with ideas for the project. Working with Chu as project architect and the classicist Bernie Fritcher, also a UCLA faculty member, as a consultant, Israel filled the book with classical references he used to devise an unlikely coherence between the original scheme, his own interventions, and the landscape. His assistant Rick Gooding captured this sensibility in an elegant topographical model that he inserted into the sketchbook after slicing away a thick portion of its pages. That's a good trick. Sneak a model into a book. A source close to the deliberations assured me that Israel's scheme was the jury's favorite, but rumors that he was stricken with HIV gave museum administrators pause. Whether such rumors swayed Getty Trust President Harold Williams, with whom the decision ultimately rested, is impossible to say. In any event, Williams chose Machado Silvetti, which completed its renovation of the villa in 2005. Israel, the source assured me, never knew how close he came to winning the commission. On the heels of Israel's work on the SRLF library here, and with the support of Andrea Rich, he began to manage to secure additional commissions here at UCLA, including the Revlon Breast Clinic that is still there and still in pretty good shape down at the medical center, and a seismic retrofit of the public policy building just across the way. But it was at another UC campus that Israel landed his most significant institutional commission, the new arts building at UC Riverside. Working closely with Chu as project architect, Israel drew inspiration from the rough forms and buff tones of a nearby arroyo and mountain. The scheme's organized with a fractured bar of program that provides a backdrop to multi-level terraces that open toward the campus and views of the mountain beyond. Boulder-like masses embedded in the terraces house performance spaces and auditoria. Horizontal surfaces were carved open with wide crevasses that allow light, air, and sculpted stairways to penetrate the space below, while a network of bridges and catwalks tether the upper reaches of the performance volumes to long balconies chiseled into the face of the bar. It is quite simply an astonishing proposal, and it received high praise from Herbert Muchamp, the New York Times. Unfortunately, budgetary concerns soon put the project on hold. By the time funds were in place and the project could move forward, Israel had died. Callis and Shortridge pressed on to complete a significantly reduced version of the project, enlisting Chu, who recently had left the firm to start her own office, as project designer. The arts building is a crucial realization of Israel's late career landscape-driven approach, and stands as the lone example of the sort of large-scale work he might have produced had he survived even just a few years longer. The Draeger House in the Berkeley Hills was commissioned to replace a house the client had lost to the Berkeley fire in 1991. Israel developed the scheme with Chu as project architect and Callis as project manager. In the earliest versions, the scheme climbed the hillside over as many as 9 levels, with 2 loosely interlocking L's defining the main volume of the house. In the final version, the architects reduced this to 4 levels, beginning with the garage at the lowest level, a den and guest suite above, living, dining, and kitchen on the 3rd level, and bedrooms for 2 children, a generous master suite, and a study for the client on the uppermost level. One enters the house through a wonderfully leaky entry hall, from which space escaped through an array of passages, alcoves, and impassable slots into adjacent rooms. Elsewhere, space is just as loosely contained. It rushes out through broad corner glazing, floats up along the canted surfaces of a light well, and spills down staircases toward the terrace and dens below. Moving from the entry toward the rear of the house places one in a tall slot of space that accesses the bedrooms. The staircase narrows as it rises, and as one turns back into the house at the top of the stair, the walls seem to pivot apart to release a wholly unexpected rush of space toward Draeger's study. It is a stunning and almost unphotographable feat of spatial choreography, one of Israel's most important achievements, which counters the curiously conventional rooms below with the open expanse of a New York loft. The house was justly celebrated in the architectural and popular press, but not everybody took so kindly to it. One critic saw in the house little more than Israel's trademark ticks and no relation to the Northern California terrain. One wonders if this critic managed to make his way to the small garden at the top of the site, where the house resolves into a single-story gable-roofed bungalow, a ghost of the hillside's incinerated past in its diminutive north elevation. So this is the last house. Like the Draeger house, the Dan house rose from the ashes of a tragic wildfire. Israel and project architect Stephen Shortridge had nearly completed designs for a renovation of Michael and Cecilia Dan's Malibu ranch house when, in November 1993, the old Topanga fire ignited high in the Santa Monica Mountains and burned all the way to the ocean, consuming their home along with 350 others. With so much design work already completed, the Dans decided to proceed with the project pretty much as designed, agreeing to rebuild much of the existing house along with Israel's modifications. For inspiration, Israel looked again to Frank Lloyd Wright, but also to Airstream trailers and the red barns that dot rural California. One arrives through an angular entry into a broad living area that opens to a pool and lush gardens beyond. And you can see a little Venturi quote on the photo in the left if you're a real nerd. I know 2 of you will see it. And I lost my place on Venturi nuditude. One arrives through an angular entry into a broad living area that opens to a pool and lush gardens beyond. Bedrooms are as conducive to individual sanctuary as the common areas are to conviviality, and each features complex millwork, like this headboard, which Israel rendered as an asymmetrical accretion of millwork and impaled with a steel column to support canted ceiling beams. Elegantly crafted in lacquered Douglas fir and capped with a fan of structure, the headboard suggests about as much calm as an afternoon nap beneath a helicopter. When I asked Cecilia about this curious assemblage, she grinned like she's grinning now, gave me a sly smile and quipped, "I guess Frank understood our marriage." I hope it's okay to use that quote. Whatever he might have gleaned about his clients' personal lives, Israel clearly understood what it meant to build in Malibu's achingly beautiful yet unforgiving terrain. High-priced real estate gets you a view, but no protection from wind and heat, Mouchant presciently observed. Despite Malibu's cool Pacific vistas, this is desert terrain, where the weather conducts seasonal seminars on the return of dust to dust. The Chumash people, who inhabited this stretch of coast for millennia, understood as much and sometimes practiced intentional burning of the volatile chaparral. Spanish settlers found the terrain inhospitable and left it largely unmolested until the 19th century, though even then it remained remote and sparsely populated. The cutting of the Pacific Coast Highway through the area in the 1920s spurred runaway development, which has been reduced to ash rebuilt, and burned again at regular intervals in the intervening century. In short, to build in Southern California requires one to come to terms with catastrophe. Most choose to look the other way, avoiding the issue until fire, rain, earthquake, or social upheaval rudely unsettle one's illusion of sanctuary. Some cope by concocting elaborate escape plans by private jet or yacht or limousine to a secluded study, bath, or bunker, or into the comforting diversions of history, gossip, or the silver screen. Others make the region's violent vocabulary their own, lashing out against its frustrating indifferences and senseless mercurial assaults. Gentler types commune with the landscape and learn to love its serrated edges, stubborn masses, and exotic forms. Others still wear their vulnerability on their sleeves, making of impermanence and ephemerality a mantra. Newcomers find their way by adopting indigenous customs and mores. They often learn to speak the local patois with uncanny fluency, and sometimes they survive by casting themselves in the role of apprentice, understudy, or protege. Sun-seared natives and a constellation of celebrities comprise a living tally of the seductive gains and withering costs of continued belief in the California dream. In nearly 2 decades in Los Angeles, Frank Israel found success with many of these approaches in his life and in his art. With the Dan House, the last design he lived to see completed, he offered another, more personal alternative. Although aspects of previous projects are present here, his earlier characterizations, cities within, urban villages, worlds apart, fail to capture the Arcadian scene he inscribed on this secluded Malibu ridge. This becomes clear when one wanders the landscape into the valley below. Turning back to regard the house, one senses more clearly the uncanny delicacy of Israel's intervention. From this vantage point, fragmented red-orange surfaces pale in significance against their leafy surroundings. Trading the perils of permanence for the more fleeting pleasures of the provisional, the house presents not a single building, but a collection of cabins, maybe just a few tents, recently erected on a hillside clearing. Here, Israel's career comes full circle. To fashion an architecture appropriate to this beautiful, duplicitous landscape, he drew on his most cherished childhood memories. Perched high above the Pacific, the Dan House reprises his beloved Camp Tahoney, a temporary haven to be treasured while it lasts and abandoned at the first sign of apocalypse. Thank you very much for listening. So, I'm perfectly happy to take some questions or corrections, as I know there are probably people here who could give them. Oh, come on. Francis, what do you got? Well, thank you.
Yes, okay. Okay, so I had a question.
Okay.
I've been in the Bay Area 12 years and seeing the construction that was viewed in the presentation, memories, especially in the Berkeley.
Yeah.
Right there, 7 years.
That guy.
Security where you see this there. I remember, is that near, how far is that, did you know how far is that from the campus of UC?
Not super far.
I think it's,
A couple of miles. It's pretty close.
okay. What was it now? What was his inspiration again on this piece?
What was his inspiration?
On this, yes, his inspiration with,
Well, he actually talked about a lot of different sources. And depending on who you talk to, you get different stories about this. You'll certainly see in the organization of the plans and sections, a very close relationship to the architecture of Adolf Loos, for instance, with this kind of three-dimensional kind of interlocking of spaces. But Israel discussed the copper cladding and the sort of curled up shape of the building as an armadillo. You know, and he often had these like very quite simple metaphors that he would attach to projects. They did a lot of work looking at the context of the kind of arts and craft houses of Northern California, and you could see that in that back elevation, right? So the house, one of the reasons I think this is one of his most highly impressive houses is the way that he takes that referentiality of his early work, where he's kind of like doing a riff on Frank Gehry or doing a riff on Rudolf Schindler. And here he's kind of absorbed those sources. And so like it's less about picking apart the references, like like you're playing a game, and it's more that the kind of aroma of those references remain, right? And so when you finally discover the little house in the back, and it looks just like a little bungalow when you go up there, it's really amazing. It's kind of stunning, because this house that seems so big and so contemporary kind of turns into a little piece of like totally appropriate kind of Northern California construction. So that one, the inspiration question gets real hard to answer, I guess. Thank you. Was that a hand or was that a? And look, I've been teaching for a long time. I know those moves. Once you make eye contact. Yes.
The house that for me is the most important, the Goldberg house. Because he really does two things. He identifies and he's using that space for two men. It's not a house for a heterosexual couple of children.
That's right.
And it's at a very important time. And it's a very California house, but at the same point, it's a very Frank Israel house. It's not a case study house.
That's very right.
And I think that's probably, being in LA at that time, that was the important house. That was the house because it also, it's him as a Jew and him as a gay man, and they come out in that house. And that's an important piece of it.
For sure. And that is something that I elaborate a little bit more in the book. But I think you're exactly right on all counts. So the house was for Howard Goldberg, a very important talent agent in Los Angeles, and his partner, Jim Bean. And the two of them had very different tastes. And if you look at the plan and you look at the way that the house was elaborated, and I guess I only have a couple of slides, only on that slide. But Howard really liked like very slick contemporary architecture. And, this was sort of Howard's domain. And Jim was much more of a kind of traditionalist. And when you go through the house, you feel both of those personalities, and they have their zones, and so the kitchen is very much kind of Jim's world, and the study above the bedroom is very much Howard's zone. It's now owned by two actors who I actually couldn't get a hold of the owner of the house, so I just went and knocked on the door one day, and they let me in. They verified my, it was a very hilarious little interview I had to go through at the door, but they, they occupy it very differently, but it has that kind of, that sense of accommodation, which I think is a really huge part of Frank's architecture, that he really got to know his clients very well, and he really worked to produce buildings that worked with them and reflected their own wants and needs. And so, when someone came and said, I want something that looks like Luis Barragan, he delivered it. I mean, sometimes a little begrudgingly. And of course, the tragedy of life as a gay man in Los Angeles in the 1980s was here as well, because Howard did not live very long after the house was completed, and Jim left the house very soon after. And this was something that happened with Frank's clients, unfortunately, often, that projects would be canceled because of illness or death or both. And ultimately, the practice was canceled for the same reason. And that the weight of AIDS over the work, I think you can feel partly you can, this sense of melancholy that you feel in a lot of the projects, this sense of kind of propulsive ambition that I think you can see in Frank trying to get these projects done because he knew the amount of time he had was limited. But also a kind of optimism to sort of construct a world that was different from the traditional sources and the kind of conventional expectations that he was often working with. And you see all of that kind of through these projects. And I hope you'll buy the book and read more into this stuff. But it's I don't get any royalties. It's like I'm not trying to shill this thing, but it's really an impressive practice the way that he really treated this residential work very personally, and both as an expression of his own position as an architect and as an expression of the clients that he was working with. And we had an interesting discussion last night at SCI-Arc with Tom Main, and we were talking about the transition in the UC Riverside building about moving to bigger institutional clients and a very different kind of relationship between architect and client, and the very complex negotiations that are involved in working on a public university campus, for instance. And that phase of Frank's career was denied to him and denied to us. You know, that those kinds of projects we see kind of one that he was in on the beginning of. And so it's very, that kind of tragedy sort of hangs over a lot of this work as well.
One quick comment.
Yeah.
I knew him well, and in the end, one of the things he was most concerned about was what would his legacy be.
Mm.
And he was very, very distressed about the fact that the lending house had gone into foreclosure.
Mm-hmm.
And he was sure that that would be taken down.
Yeah.
That was his first public, and that was very distressing.
Yeah, and I think you know, one of the things that I hope comes about with this book is, you know, Frank has kind of faded from a lot of the conversations in Los Angeles over the last 30 years. And sadly, a lot of the work no longer remains. You know, there are very few of these houses that still exist. Another was just lost in the fires in January, at least one. Almost all of the commercial, the film interior spaces that he designed, there's only one of those left. And so the question of legacy is a difficult one because so little remains and so little public work was completed in his lifetime. And so I hope that the book will kind of bring his story and bring a kind of a sort of cognizance of his architecture back into the conversation, because I think it's overdue. And I think that the story that comes out of LA in the 1990s is narrower than it should be. You know, that Frank was a very different kind of architect because he was a very different kind of person. There were a lot of women-led firms that were operating in the period that always kind of operated in the shadow of the very tall and loud men that were kind of siphoning up the attention. And I'm not claiming that they didn't deserve attention, but the story of LA in the 80s and 90s is a much more complicated situation than I think it is, than the way it was initially put down in the magazines. And I think the work for historians today is to kind of broaden that view. So I hope that there'll be more work like this that tries to kind of open up the lens a little bit. Yes.
You're hitting on a really important point, is that a lot of, he's died young, but a lot of the architects who are part of this movement are aging now. I mean, you mentioned Tom Main and Frank, and that there hasn't really been a compendium yet of looking at sort of Southern California style coming out of the late 70s through, you know, the early to mid 90s. Where this work was, it was the last time the work could really be unique to a place. Because once you got to 2001 and the prevalence of the internet, you kind of see this mashup work where it's not as regional as it was.
Yeah.
Prior to the connectivity that we have now. And I'd love to see you did such a good job with this, print out something, that looks at this work as a group, because when I look at Fred Fisher's work and I look at the work by Israel and, you know, the early Morphosis work and so much of this work is such a language that was so unique, that, you know, it's gone now, a lot of it. I mean, you see a little bit of it here and there, but a lot of that's gone. And it would be nice to have and talk to, get the stories while the people are still around to tell them and to show it really for how powerful it was. And, you know, it drew a lot of the next generation, meaning me and other people who are probably in this room. This is the work that drew us to Southern California. I mean, we saw what was going on from wherever we were, and it was mind blowing. You could do this, you know, if you were coming from, you know, Vermont or Northern California or even New York, frankly, was lagged behind at that point in time. You know, what was going on here was really such a nexus of creativity. Anyway, thank you for the lecture.
Well, thank you for that comment. And if you're taking on PR clients, I've written a pitch for that book. So give me a couple of years. But I think it's more than one book's work of work.
Yeah.
More than one book's worth of work. That's a hard sentence to say.
I got one more. We interviewed Tom and Eric and Fred and Craig. Robert's no longer with us. We did interview them about 4 months ago or 5 months ago through that group that does the walking tours.
Oh, great.
Russell Brown.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so we did interview all those guys up tape, and that photograph you showed of them all together on the beach, that was sort of that was the thing that got everybody together, and sort of looking at that, talking about those times. And you know, getting it on tape again before it's too late, you know, not to be pessimist, but.
No, I'm glad you're doing it, and I want to get a look at what you've done. So let's talk after.
You've got to talk to Russell.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Neil.
So the famous photograph on the beach,
Yeah,
you showed Frank is not in the photograph.
that's right.
Do you know if he was supposed to?
No, not this Frank.
No, different Frank.
The other Frank.
Yeah. Yeah. He's not in the photograph, right?
No, he's not.
Do you know why? No.
At that moment, 1980, Frank was doing other stuff. This was the height of his Hollywood moment. He had at that time joined the Set Designers Guild. He may have been in the Philippines when that photo was taken. But Frank his association with this group came much later, you know, and because he was working in very different circles. He was very close with Frank Gehry. They were good friends, and Frank was, you know, giving him a lot of referrals for some of his earliest projects. But it was really after Bright and Associates, the renovation of the Eames office space, that Frank really started to be seen as like part of that core group. And part of it was the habits of journalists at the time. Part of it was, you know, the kind of different client groups that they were working in. But I think it does speak to the, you know, there's a lot more difference between those guys that are on the beach. You know, between just those six, they're a very different cast of characters. And then the group that was sort of operating in the same space, there's a lot of difference as well. And I think this sort of journalistic lumping together under a single kind of label has a homogenizing effect. And so Frank was maybe lumped in a little too quickly. Or maybe, you know, the notion of the LA school or the Santa Monica school or the various names that it's been given, and I've given it some, it makes it easy to domesticate difference. And I think that the project is really to sort of proliferate it.
So I asked this because not only did you show it, and then kind of by proxy, contextualize him within this group, but he was also outside it, and one could say Gary is the avenue into it, but every one of those architects, you know, had, and it's been referred to in terms of the kind of psychoanalytical aspect of doing all the work in LA, everyone would say, I'm an outsider.
That's true.
No, wait, I'm an insider.
Yeah.
So the degree to which Frank Israel was an outsider, you know, coming from New York and so forth, probably has to do with, you know, exactly when. Frank is an outsider from Canada, but he lives in LA since 17,
Right.
right?
Right.
So he's got pretty deep roots, and Tom came to USC in the 60s and so forth. So I wonder, you know, or my question to you is, and not having read the book, it seemed like for all these architects, and I actually had Gary at this very time for a studio in GSC, and he brought people like Richard Serra around, and there was a palpable sense of desperation. Like, my next project's gonna be the last one.
Yeah.
No one will hire me again. I'm too weird, etc. And yet that fomented a whole, you know, kind of world. What do you think Frank's relationship really was to, you know, the inside-outside question?
Well, I think that he was very savvy in the way that he constructed his persona. And I think he was able to play both roles pretty well. I didn't know him. A lot of the people in the room did know him, but I think Frank was he was a really gregarious guy and could kind of very quickly feel part of what was going on around him. And, you know, as I kind of unraveled the ways that he entered various contexts and suddenly was like in the middle of it, and think to how hard it is to pull that off. I mean, you know, he had a certain kind of social skill that I think he used very well, that helped him play that insider side. But he, you know, he was also very different from these guys, you know, and I mean, they're all outside. Fred Fisher and I went to the same high school in suburban Cleveland.
At the same time.
Huh? Yeah. Yeah, see, Fred should ride a bike more. But, you know, like of that group, you know, Eric's the only one from LA. But I don't know. I mean, it's tough to reconstruct, and I've been working on this world for a long time, as you know, and when we put together that first Heretics show, they kind of needed safety in numbers, you know, like they needed the energy of each other to sort of feed this world. And Frank wasn't part of those early years, although he was in LA. And it's further complicated, you know, like that Gary would give so many referrals to Frank Israel, but he was conspicuously not giving them to those guys. And, you know, so there's a great movie to be made about all of this stuff, or a kind of a semi-fictional rendition of this. But I don't know. I mean, what do you think? You think he was, I mean, you were here when he was operating.
I think Frank, you know, a little bit, but certainly didn't have those kinds of, you know, let's go to the bar and talk it out kind of things. The perception of, let's see, who was teaching at UCLA? I think Robert and Craig were, you know, and then they shifted to SCI-Arc, and so SCI-Arc, you know, just took up so much gravity in UCLA in the 90s.
Yeah.
Before Sylvia, you know, it was a bit of a wilderness. Let's say, just speaking from the level of noise, it was quieter. And so I think Frank, when I came over here, felt like he was trying to make the most noise he could, yet not as many people were listening as he would like.
Yeah.
Maybe giving rise to some aspect of the, you know, disaffection he might have had, or tendency to be critical all the time and so forth. But he definitely had a presence. I was saying earlier, I never saw him at SCI-Arc.
Yeah.
He wasn't moving easily. So that's what gives me some idea of what his footprint was,
Yeah.
you know, in reality.
Well, and he had also, I mean, the lifestyle that he led. I mean, you know, between teaching here, he was teaching around the country, you know, by the 90s anyway. The treatment of his illness was a huge project. And the time and energy that he put into cultivating clients for his practice was equally huge. You know, I mean, he was always on the move. And I think, to put it very bluntly, I think he understood that he just didn't have time to fuck around. And he was very determined to kind of advance the practice as quickly as he could. And I think the quietness about his illness that he maintained in public until very late in his life was part of that, you know, because he was worried that it would impact the practice, you know, that if it was out widely discussed that he was sick, that he wouldn't be getting the kinds of commissions that he wanted to get. The Getty Villa, I think, is an example of exactly that sort of problem. So I think that certainly feeds in to answering questions like this. But it's weird, you know, like I always find it, like when I do a project like this, I mean, you learn a lot. Like I feel like I got to know the guy very well, but then whenever I meet somebody and they start asking me questions about it, I'm immediately stumped. You know, like I have no idea. Like I could tell you what pieces of paper are in which piles in the archive, but it's a very tricky thing, you know, that when you do work like this, and I said a version of this last night, you kind of construct a version of a person that is not the whole person, and is probably starts to kind of get refracted through my own eyes and, you know, what I'm looking for and whatever biases I bring to the table. And, you know, like not being a gay man who was operating in the 70s and 80s in LA, you know, like I'm coming at this from a very different world, you know, and so like I don't think the story's over. I mean, I think that there is a ton of room for other scholars to kind of look at this period and take up different aspects of it. And I hope they do, because there's a ton of material at the Getty and somebody's got to look at this stuff. I mean, I only looked at about a quarter of it just with Frank's archive. So it's, there's a lot. What else we got? Cecilia's got something for me. Now you're acting like a student. Yeah.
No. We were just-
Oh, I know.
Did you ask me a question?
I want you to ask me one.
No, I think you got it, you know, you really, from just what this lecture, I haven't read the book yet, but you got so much of Frank that I only knew Frank from 19. So we were working with Frank from about 1990. When the house had started, we were working on a remodel of an existing house. And we started about 1990, and between Frank being ill, which we didn't know initially, and the city of Malibu, in 1993, we were just getting ready to pull permits when the house burned down. Yeah, the existing house. And so from there, it took about a year for them to design the remodel, which was really basically taking the remodel and constructing a new house from that.
Yeah.
And then we moved in 95. So I mean, I worked with Frank for 5 years. It was so much fun.
Yeah.
It really was.
No, it seemed like all of the clients that I spoke with, and I spoke with a lot of them, they you know, there was some recounting of the difficulty of saying like these are not easy houses to build or detail for sure. But the kind of pleasure that the clients seem to have taken in the process was really impressive. And, having spent a lot of my time, the kind of early part of my career practicing and dealing with clients, I know how hard it is to keep them happy. It's really impressive that so many had such fond memories of working with him. And I think that is probably too rare among architects. Like, I know a lot of clients who won't be in the same room with the architects they've worked with. So,
I mean, to that point, in terms of the differentiation between Frank and the other artists in the Venice photo is perhaps maybe it is because he's gay. Frank really got on very well with women. I mean, I knew Frank through great friend of mine, Julia Bloomfield, and Frank was absolutely an incredibly close friend of Julia. And she just talked about all the times that she was depressed, Frank would take her shopping, and this was like a sort of a Frank therapy that he did without. Did he do that with you?
No,
I mean,
no,
I don't
no,
think
no.
it's quite a lot of women, and I don't think Tom May would take women shopping. And so I think there's just a different way in which Frank sort of conducted himself sort of in the world. And he also had, tons of friends in Hollywood. I think his Hollywood connections are just so much of the story. You've already talked about it, Todd, and your book and your talk are just really so good. Especially you've never met. I mean, really, really good. But there were these little details to the way Frank sort of operated, and one of them was really this just understanding it, like shoes, dresses.
yeah.
And you could talk about that stuff with a real passion, and then you could talk about ancient Rome with incredible erudition and sort of slam all this stuff together that those other Venice artists sort of didn't do really. Wasn't their thing. Maybe Craig, maybe Craig a bit, maybe Eric a little, but
I'm just gonna tag on to Francis's point. Joe Day, a friend, and Michael, you mentioned him. Joe, I heard Joe describe LA architects once as out of work actors. And I think the photo on the beach, in terms of who's missing, is the actor was acting.
Get this lines back on Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The computer clearly wants to stand and stop and have a glass of wine, so why don't we?
have the next project already on my I just was fascinated by this conversation. We just part of the day, part of the school, and we are part of that.